We'll use that text in just a moment. Deborah and I were down in Parkersburg the other day and at a bookstore, and I was toying with buying a new Bible, going from large print to ginormous print. And I opened it up and I realized blurry is blurry. It doesn't matter if it's 100 feet long or if it's just... And so I made a New Year's resolution that I've had these for a long time. You'll probably start seeing me wear them more because blurry just doesn't work when you're trying to find a text in a scripture or something and be accurate about that. And so anyway, I thought my New Year's resolution for me, in a very trivial kind of way, is to start wearing my glasses more often. And that actually leads me into what I want to share with you. It is a beginning almost of a new year. And I suppose all of us maybe at a new year get a little, contemplative. We think about things in our lives. We're trying to decide what kinds of things should we change. And I know sometimes you'll think about, I need to eat better, or I need to be healthier, or I need to walk more, or I need to write. And we think about all those physical kinds of things that we often think of as New Year's resolutions. But can I challenge all of us this morning maybe to think a little bit about the idea that maybe my New Year's resolution needs to be more spiritually focused. That maybe it's a time for me to be reflective and think about maybe some things in my life spiritually that I could improve upon and grow stronger in my relationship with God. And are there any obstacles to that? What happens with us with some New Year's resolutions, right, is you could have a New Year's resolution to go out and walk more, but that requires you to get up and put shoes on and go, right? There are obstacles to that path, or maybe there are other barriers that might occur. And I think if we're honest about the barriers and find ways to overcome those barriers, then we can improve upon things in better ways. And so that's kind of what I want to do. And I want you to think very practically here at the outset of our study. Here's the first moment of challenge, right? Everything was great on the earth until Genesis 3. God was caring for, Adam and Eve had been blessed, that God gave them very little restriction in so many ways as it relates to responsibilities they had before God. And He had only really forbidden them, right, in this text that Larry just read, to eat from that one tree that God said, don't do that. And like man has been doing since then, we seem to always go to that which we're not supposed to. And the fall of man occurs. But here's the thought I want you to appreciate out of this. How long did it take to fix the problem? Thousands of years, right, passed from the time that Adam and Eve partake of that fruit that God had forbidden them. It takes a long, long process by which for them ultimately to get to the point where Jesus enters into the picture and we find the resolve and remedy that we need as it relates to the challenge of sin. And what I want us to appreciate from that is that the process of spiritual growth takes time. I think sometimes we think that we ought to be able to wake up tomorrow and be 100 times stronger faithfully than we were yesterday. And brethren and friend, the best advice I could give to you as it relates to that is it doesn't work that way. The spiritual problem that we have happened in the days of Genesis chapter 3, and it took thousands of years for a plan to ultimately unfold and culminate in Jesus to resolve that problem. I'm encouraging you to appreciate this morning, be patient. Spiritual growth and the remedy to the sins and challenges in my own personal walk don't happen immediately. It takes time in order to heal. It takes time in order to learn. And it may, yes, at times take longer than we think. We just heard that reading out of Genesis chapter 3. Now fast forward into the New Testament in Matthew chapter 26. And as you're turning to that, just think with me for a moment about how much history, right, had to unfold. How much history unfolded between Adam and Eve eating of that tree that they had been forbidden from, and all of the various things that happened in the history of man leading to ultimately Jesus. That's a long time. That in many ways God was being patient with a process. Where God was being long-suffering with a process. Where God, the New Testament writer says, winked at a period of time, until ultimately He would bring the answer in Jesus Christ. In verse 55 of Matthew chapter 26, in that hour Jesus said to the multitudes, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? I sat daily with you teaching in the temple, and you did not seize me. But all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. And then all the disciples forsook Him and fled, and those who had laid hold of Jesus led Him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. And the process that leads to the crucifixion of Jesus has now begun. A culmination of thousands of years, a culmination of prophet after prophet, helping people understand what it is God was trying to fulfill and the purposes He was trying to honor. And friends, I'm simply trying to extrapolate an example from that for us all, that if God could be patient for thousands of years in order to bring the remedy and reconciliation of sin, then I maybe need to be a little more patient with myself. Now you notice I said patient. I didn't say excuse myself. I didn't say, pardon my own sins. I didn't say any of that. But what I am trying to challenge us to appreciate is that spiritual growth is a process of time. And the truth is, if we're honest, you and I didn't get where we are overnight. If I find myself spiritually challenged, if I find a weakness of faith in my life, I probably, if I'm honest, realize that didn't happen in an instant. It happened over a period of time. One poor decision led to another poor decision, led to another poor decision, right? One bad choice leads to another bad choice, leads to another. And because I did no course correction in that process, now all of a sudden, I'm deeply rooted in some very challenging and difficult things. The behaviors that I find myself are very hard to overcome. And I simply challenge all of us that even if we feel that's where we are in our faith, even if we feel that's where I am spiritually, with the right process of time, spiritual growth is not an impossibility for me. But it just may take the same amount of time, energy, and effort that it took to get away from faith. And the things that led me away from the God that I should be honoring and serving. And the problem is there's obstacles everywhere. There are things that you and I are going to have to overcome and be patient with as we go through those various difficulties. Let me share a couple of examples. Go back into 1 Samuel chapter 8. 1 Samuel chapter 8. I think about how God must have felt, right? God had led them out of Egypt. He had brought them to a promised land. He had dealt with various obstacles along the way. He brings them into that promised land, and He provides for them judges to rule over them. And He spreads those judges out in various places so they can have the ability, no matter where they are, to find remedy and answer to the difficulties. And God had every intention to just let His people be governed that way. But they looked at all the neighbors, and everybody else had a king, right? And so the people come and they've decided that these judges just aren't working out. We've got to be like everybody else. We need a king. And notice verse 7 of chapter 8. Samuel was concerned about this. Praise before God, verse 6 says. In verse 7, and the Lord says to Samuel, heed the voice of the people and all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. Sometimes the problems we create as it relates to our relationship with God are there because of my own choosing, and I have to admit that. The problems they're going to encounter, the difficulties they're going to have after these kings, and by the way, it only took them how many to start having problems? One. Saul, right? Saul was given this great ability to be king, and he starts to reign, and things are good for a little while, and then he begins to think that he's bigger than God. And God decides, your family's not going to have the kingdom any longer. I'm going to pass that off to David. David's a pretty good king. Solomon is a wise king, but he doesn't control his wives or his family in very good ways. And by the time he is gone, the divided kingdom comes. It only took them a couple of generations for the demise of their own choosing to set root. What's your point, Brian? My point, friends, is sometimes the obstacles in front of us were caused by my choices, and I have to admit that. Spiritual growth requires me to be honest that I chose that path. I made that decision. I decided that what God wanted from me was not what I wanted for me, and it led me down a path that's leading me away from God. The obstacles are real. And if I'm not honest about them, then it's going to be hard to correct. Go over into John chapter 7. Let's bounce back into the New Testament for a moment. John chapter 7, verse 1. Samuel had the people to deal with and the obstacles they were presenting to him, and the kings presented problems for God's people, fulfilling his plans. Bounce now into John chapter 7, verse 1. After these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for he did not want to walk in Judea, because the Jews sought to kill him. I've always found it interesting, by the way, just step back from this for a moment and think about it. The plan and purposes of God for Jesus was for him to die. Right? It's part of the whole purpose and plan that God had determined before the foundations of the world, that ultimately He would send His Son, and through His purposes He would ultimately die. But He would die on God's terms and on Jesus' terms. It's an interesting point I think you and I need to appreciate maybe a little more. There were moments where people wanted to kill Jesus, and He had to overcome those obstacles in order to ultimately reach the right time and moment that God planned, and the manner in which He would die according to God's purposes. Now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand in verse 2, and now verse 3. His brothers therefore said to Him, Depart from here and go into Judea, that your disciples also may see the works that you are doing. For no one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. For even his brothers did not believe him. Those who were closest to Jesus had no faith in who He was. Isn't that sad? Those who were raised right alongside with this one who was wiser than the wise of those in Jerusalem, this one who came forth in miraculous ways. Jesus should have been embraced by those who were closest to Him, but they're almost taunting Him. If you think these powers and miracles that you're actually doing up here in Capernaum and in around the Sea of Galilee are actually meaningful, then why are you hiding up here? Get on down to Jerusalem and let's see what happens when you expose yourself as this great powerful one down there. And you might think, well, they have good intentions here, but verse 5 tells us that's not true. What's your point, Brian? My point is, friends, in spiritual growth, you're going to have detractors. There are going to be people around who don't believe your genuineness. You may have people who don't believe your penitence. You may have people that believe you haven't changed one bit. You may have people in your life that are completely convinced that you're a fraud. You might think, how can anybody think Jesus is a fraud? But even His own brothers thought He was. At least at this point in time. I'm not saying that to disappoint you or to make you feel, oh, why bother, right? If everybody's going to be... No, I'm just trying to set the realities for us. When you choose spiritual things, when you choose to grow in that relationship, when you choose faith over all other things, when you have that level of dedication to your Creator, there are going to be people in your life, and yes, unfortunately, at times, even some of the closest people to you in your life, who scoff and look down and detract from that commitment. Jesus doesn't necessarily get angry here. It's interesting in verse 6. He just simply says to them, my time has not yet come. It's interesting though. He says, my time has not yet come. These things you're telling me to do, they're going to happen, but not yet. That's going to happen in my time. But notice, but your time is already ready. All these things you want me to go and fulfill down in Jerusalem, there's a proper place and time for it, but your time to be believers is right now, Jesus says. Your time to begin to appreciate and understand who I am is right now. Friends, again, here's our example. There may be obstacles, but don't let that detract you from being committed that this is the right moment in time to start living more faithfully. To live as the believers live and to let God's Word and Jesus' testimony guide us. There will be detractors. There will be obstacles. And they'll be everywhere and in different forms. Be patient and be dedicated. But recognize, as Jesus' brothers needed to recognize, that it was time. And maybe for many of us, it's time. I've waited long enough to get this process moving forward. I've waited long enough to ignore the detractors. It's time. Jesus, in the end of this process upon the cross, one of the 7 things that Jesus simply says in short words in verse 30 is, it is finished. And bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. In his time, in his way, after thousands of years, it is finished. Jesus completes the process. Despite the obstacles, despite the challenges. Friends, can I challenge and encourage us to do that this morning? To dedicate ourselves to real, profitable, purposeful, spiritual growth. Be patient. Recognize that it may not have, the weaknesses I'm experiencing may not have happened overnight, and the correction and the course correction of that may not happen overnight, but I'm going to stay the course, and I'm going to finish this. I'm going to finish. I want to be like Paul at the end of his race when he says, I fought the good fight, I've kept the faith, I've finished the course. Despite the obstacles and challenge that might be around. But let me offer this. The longer we wait, the harder it is. Because the less concerned we become about it. I want you to go back into Isaiah for a moment with me. The very beginning of the book of Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 1. And I want you to notice Isaiah's description of the people, and they acted as though they had no understanding that this was their realities. In fact, in the earlier part of the text, he even talks about an ox that knows his owner and a donkey knows where the crib is. But verse 3 says, but Israel does not know, my people do not consider. Verse 4, chapter 1 of Isaiah, alas, sinful nation. A people laden with iniquity, a brood of evildoers, children who are corrupters. They have forsaken the Lord. They have provoked to anger the Holy One of Israel. They have turned away backward. Why should you be stricken again? You will revolt more and more. The whole head is sick and the whole heart faints. Pause for a minute. That's a pretty sad state or condition to get in. You know what Isaiah just said to them? He says, God, it wouldn't matter what God did. He could send 100 more prophets and you would ignore all 100 of them just as much as you have everyone else that's come to encourage you. He could strike you again and again and again and you'll still revolt more and more. They had become calloused to their problems. What's your point, Brian? My point is very simple, friends. Don't do that. Don't disconnect from God to such a degree and to such an extent and for such a length of time that I become callous to it, where it wouldn't matter how many phone calls, how many letters, how many thoughts, how many prayers, how many things, I'm just refusing. That was the condition that the people had reached, and God determines in the days of Isaiah to just bring them into captivity because of it. The process of spiritual growth is difficult and challenging, and yes, we have to be patient, but we've got to start, and we've got to start sooner than later. Because the longer time goes on, it moves from being patient with oneself to just simple procrastination and ultimately hardening of the spirit and soul. It goes away from, well, you know what, I've stumbled again, but I'm going to get back up and I'm going to be patient with this process, right? That's one mindset that needs to happen in spiritual growth. But we can also get a mindset of where we never really actually begin the process. We've always have a reason why we're not doing the things necessary, and we very systematically begin to harden our mindset and our souls and our hearts to any kind of growth process that could take place. And Israel became a perfect example of that. From the sole of the foot even to the head, there is no soundness in it, but wounds and bruises and putrefying sores, they have not been closed or bound up or soothed with ointment. You've been disciplined from head to toe. And he uses this analogy. You've been disciplined from head to toe. You haven't soothed it with ointment. You haven't learned anything from that discipline. You haven't grown from it at all. That's what happens when people just let time go by without a concern or a worry or a thought at all as to what they need to be doing in relationship to the Creator. And maybe in that process, I just simply need to re-educate myself. And that sounds odd maybe, but I want you to think about this with me for a minute. Weird question, but have you ever forgotten anything? You know, right? We do that. I mean, I can't tell you how many times, because of certain behaviors and patterns, right? We get it, where you're going somewhere and you go the wrong way. Why are you all looking at me like I'm the only one that's ever done that before? Right? You're driving, because all you do is really go to Walmart anyway, right? So you get in the car and you drive to Walmart and you realize you weren't supposed to go to Walmart. But you're so trained thinking that way. And what's that mean? Well, it means sometimes you got to re-educate. You got to rethink things. Friends, it's possible that things that I knew 25, 35 years ago about the Scriptures, I may have to get back and rethink those and revisit those and meditate upon those very basic and fundamental principles again and remind myself of those things. Re-educate myself about the truths of God's Word and appreciate the testimony of it. That may be part. Stay in the book of Isaiah if you're still there. Jump over to chapter 5. Chapter 5 and verse 20. He gives a warning. He says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Woe to men mighty at drinking wine. Woe to men valiant for mixing intoxicating drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away justice from the righteous man." What's the point he's trying to make here? He's simply trying to start this process by being cautious. Be careful that we don't flip what's good and evil around. And he cites some illustrations for us there in that text. Be careful of how you define good and evil, because really the only one who gets to define that is God. Right? He's the only one that gets to define that. My responsibility in my spiritual growth is to acknowledge what God has said is good and honor that, and acknowledge what God has said is evil and avoid that. But the truth is, maybe over time I've confused those things. Maybe over time I've been guilty of wanting a little of that evil. By the way, let's just be honest with that. So be honest with it. All right, we can lie to ourselves about the truth of that, and it won't help us any. Just be honest. I was allured by that. I wanted part of that, or all of it. But my conscience was telling me that's not right. And so what I had to do was start redefining what's evil and redefining what's good. And maybe what my spiritual growth process really needs is a re-education of what God has said is good and what God has said is evil. And let Him be the definer of that. In this growth process that we're talking about, and if we're challenging ourselves to that in the coming year, we may have to get back into the Bible and reevaluate and reconsider. And maybe what I've over time been behaviorally adjusted to thinking is right and wrong and good and evil isn't really what God has said. And I'm going to admit a reality for you that just we have to accept. When you really dedicate yourself to all things that are good in the eyes of God, and you really avoid all things that God says is evil, it's a really lonely place sometimes. It can become a lonely place. Because there's not a whole lot of people doing that. There are a lot of good people in this world. Don't misunderstand me. There are a lot of great people in the world. There are a lot of generous, kind, loving, well-meaning people in the world. They're friendly, they're neighborly. They don't intentionally go out to harm anybody. They're good people. But very few really dedicate themselves to all things that are good in the eyes of God and avoid all things that are evil in the eyes of God. That's a lonely place sometimes. And I don't say that to be dramatic. I just say that to help you appreciate that be ready for that, right? Be ready for that moment where you feel isolated. Because it's going to happen to all of us. Not all the time. I don't feel that way all the time, by the way. I feel very blessed to be surrounded by lots of people who are trying to do that very thing. None of us are perfect at it. We all falter and slip, and we pray for one another, and we encourage one another. And I've got the benefit of that. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but there are times. There are times where it's going to be you, your faith, your conscience, your choices, and a decision to be made about what God has said is good or what God has said is evil, and I've got to maybe do that on my own. And just be ready for that reality. Let me share with you something Jeremiah said. In Jeremiah chapter 5. In Jeremiah chapter 5 and verse 1, he says, within the prophecy, run to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem. See now and know and seek in her open places. If you can find a man, if there's anyone who executes judgment, who seeks the truth, and I will pardon her. Yeah, it reminds me a little bit. Remember when Abraham speaks to God about the concerns over Sodom and Gomorrah, and you can you find, he whittles that number clear down to 10. If you could find 10 folks that want to, on Jeremiah's prophecy, he says, if you can find one, that's how bad it had gotten. If you can find a man, if there's anyone who executes judgment, who seeks the truth, I'll pardon her. I believe what God means simply is this: if you can find one, I'll pardon the whole nation. Though they say, as the Lord lives, surely they swear falsely. O Lord, are not your eyes on the truth? You have stricken them, but they have not grieved. You have consumed them, but they've refused to receive correction. They have made their faces harder than rock. They have refused to return. It's the same sentiment we shared out of Isaiah's prophecy, same time period. Sometimes, folks, you and I are going to look around and we're hoping that somebody, is there anybody who thinks like I think about this? Right? Is there anybody who's trying to honor God in this moment as I'm trying to honor God in this moment? And there are going to be times where we feel like Jeremiah. We're given a task that's impossible to fulfill, because there isn't. But again, I'm sharing that with us to not discourage us. I'm sharing that with us to prepare us, to be ready for that moment. And in some ways go, well, not so that we don't say, well, I didn't realize it was going to be this hard. I'm telling you this morning in this lesson, yes, at times it's going to be hard to fulfill and have the kind of spiritual growth that I need, though. And the benefits, right? The benefits ultimately come. Let me conclude with this. 2 Timothy chapter 4. Because the hardest fought battles bring the sweetest victories, right? Sometimes we stumble and falter. We make mistakes along the way. I've been wanting to work on my man cave a little bit down there at the house, and Sam bought me a present to help me start that process. And Isaac and I and Sam just like pros down there putting this thing together, this petition thing. And we had that whole frame ready and put together and just perfectly ready to set it up. But we realized after we had the frame completely done that we forgot to put the curtains in between the poles, and it all had to come back apart so that we could put this thing together right. Sometimes even when you're trying to fulfill something right, you make mistakes and you have to correct them. But it was a simple little thing, but when it was done, we just stood back and went, hey, there it is. And there's such greater things that we're actually pointing for in our spiritual walk, right? Go back to what we looked at in our study this morning in our Bible class with the Apostle Paul. Paul made lots of mistakes, faced lots of obstacles, had to be patient with a lot of things, felt alone at times. Everything that we've talked about this morning, the Apostle Paul faced. But here was his conclusion. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. That finally there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day, and not to me only, but also to all who love his appearing. I'm not saying spiritual growth will be easy. What I'm saying is it will be worth it. I'm not saying that it will be simple and it won't have its hardships and it won't have its difficulties. I'm saying it'll be worth it. And so for the new year, if you're trying to determine whether or not faith will be on that list of resolutions, if commitment to God will be on that list of resolutions, then I challenge you, put it there and put it at the top of the list. And acknowledge the realities of the obstacles that may come in that, but realize at the end of the day, it will be worth it. I can't imagine one soul sitting around the throne of God in his heavenly home saying, boy, I wish I hadn't done this. Can that even be a thing? Somebody in heaven regretting? It feels difficult now, but if we'll not faint and we'll stay dedicated, the reward comes. And I challenge all of us this morning to embrace the realities of spiritual growth and make it happen in all of our lives, because it will absolutely be worth it. How can we help you do that today? Can we help you step into his promises if you've never understood or appreciated the benefits of remission of sins? Baptism leads us to that cleansing power of the blood of the Lamb. Can we encourage you in that today if you've never experienced that? Maybe you need to step into his promises. Maybe I just need to go home and get on my knees and pray before the Father and say, give me the courage and strength and integrity of mind to grow starting now. And then be ready for those obstacles and realities that might come our way, but be determined to that spiritual growth that ultimately leads me to the home of God. And a new year is a great time in many ways to start that process. And if we can encourage you today, pray for you today, help you in some way, then we'd invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.